January 7th, 1945. Brussels, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The guns were still cooling. The bodies were still being counted. And yet, in a single room with microphones and reporters, the Western Alliance came closer to collapse than it ever had on the battlefield. That morning, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stepped before the press. To the British public, he was a hero. To many American commanders, he was already a difficult ally. But what he said next shocked both sides of the Atlantic. Montgomery spoke confidently, calmly, almost casually. He described the German offensive in the Ardennes, the largest surprise attack the Allies had faced in the West, and then claimed that he had personally handled the battle. He implied that American forces had been disorganized, that British leadership had restored order, that the crisis had been resolved under his direction. What Montgomery did not say was just as important as what he did. He barely mentioned the role of the U.S. First Army. He downplayed the sacrifice of American units that had held the line under impossible conditions. He ignored the fact that tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers had fought, frozen, and died to stop Hitler's last gamble. To British ears, the message sounded like confidence. To American ears, it sounded like humiliation. Within hours, the reaction inside the Allied command was explosive. General Omar Bradley, commander of U.S. forces in Europe, was furious. So was General George S. Patton, whose Third Army had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, turning north in winter conditions to relieve Bastogne. To them, Montgomery's words were not just arrogance. They were a public rewriting of history. Behind closed doors, American officers spoke openly about betrayal. The trust that had held the coalition together since 1942 was cracking, not under German fire, but under Allied ego. By the end of the day, Bradley believed something unthinkable had happened. The alliance itself was in danger. Within 24 hours, Bradley drafted his resignation letter. If Montgomery's version of events stood unchallenged, he could no longer serve under a command structure that dismissed American sacrifice. The situation escalated faster than anyone expected. News of the press conference reached London. Then it reached Washington. At the very moment the Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine and finish the war, the unity of command, the foundation of victory in the West, was unraveling. And now only one man had the authority to stop it: Winston Churchill. He understood immediately what was at stake: not pride, not reputation, but the survival of the alliance itself. If this crisis was not contained, the final months of the war in Europe could descend into open conflict between commanders who were supposed to be fighting the same enemy. Within 48 hours, Churchill would be forced to intervene personally, in Parliament, to prevent the greatest political disaster the Western Allies had faced during World War II. All because of one press conference, one microphone, and one moment where words nearly destroyed everything bullets could not. The fallout from Montgomery's press conference spread like a shockwave through Allied headquarters. In General Dwight D. Eisenhower's command staff, the mood turned icy. Eisenhower had spent years holding together a fragile coalition of nations, egos, and ambitions. Now, with Germany close to defeat, that coalition was threatening to fracture from within. For American commanders, Montgomery's remarks crossed a red line. General George S. Patton was the first to explode. He had just completed one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war, turning the entire U.S. Third Army north in the middle of winter to relieve Bastogne. His soldiers fought through snow, ice, and German armor to save the surrounded 101st Airborne. To Patton, Montgomery's suggestion that the battle had been handled by British command was an insult not just to him but to every American soldier who had fought in the Ardennes. Patton openly demanded that Montgomery be relieved of command. Behind closed doors, American officers questioned whether the British were deliberately reshaping the narrative to claim credit for a battle they had not fought alone. The anger was not symbolic, it was operational. Trust between staffs eroded, cooperation slowed, decisions were second-guessed, and all of this was happening while Allied forces were preparing for the final push into Germany. Omar Bradley, already shaken, took matters further. He believed Montgomery's statements undermined American authority in front of both the press and the public. Worse, they threatened Eisenhower's unified command structure, the very system that allowed Allied armies to function as one force. Bradley drafted his resignation not as a gesture, but as a warning. If Montgomery's version of events became accepted history, The American command would no longer tolerate being treated as a subordinate partner in a war it was paying for in blood. Eisenhower found himself trapped. Publicly confronting Montgomery risked a diplomatic crisis with Britain. Ignoring American outrage risked losing his senior commanders. Either choice could shatter the alliance. Meanwhile, the situation reached the political level. Reports from Brussels made their way to Washington, where American officials were stunned by the scale of the backlash. The press began to pick up fragments of the dispute. What had started as a single press conference now threatened to become an open transatlantic scandal. In London, the danger was understood immediately. British leaders realized that Montgomery's words, spoken without restraint, had done what German armies had failed to do since 1942, place the Allied partnership itself in jeopardy. This was no longer a military disagreement. It was a crisis of leadership, credibility, and respect. Eisenhower urgently requested a political solution. Military discipline alone would not fix this. The issue had moved beyond generals and battlefields. Only a statesman could repair the damage, and in Britain that meant one man, Winston Churchill. Churchill knew that if American confidence in British leadership collapsed, the consequences would extend far beyond the Battle of the Bulge. Post-war planning, occupation zones, even the political balance of the Western world were now at risk. The war in Europe was nearing its end. But the alliance that was supposed to win it was cracking, not from enemy fire but from pride. And Churchill had only hours to prepare his response. What he would say next would determine whether the Western Allies marched into Germany united or divided. The crisis reached its peak in London. Within 48 hours of Montgomery's press conference, Winston Churchill understood that silence was no longer an option. The unity of the Western Alliance, the very force that had carried the war from Normandy to the German border, was at risk of collapsing from within. Churchill faced a nightmare scenario. If the Americans believed Britain was claiming credit for their sacrifices, trust would be shattered. If Eisenhower lost Bradley or Patton, unified command could crumble. And if the alliance fractured now, just weeks before the final invasion of Germany, history would remember it as an unforgivable failure. On January 10, 1945, Churchill rose before Parliament. His speech was careful, measured, calculated. Without directly naming Montgomery, Churchill emphasized one central truth. The Battle of the Bulge had been a combined Allied victory, achieved through shared sacrifice, coordination, and mutual trust. He praised American forces explicitly. He acknowledged the decisive role played by U.S. armies in stopping and reversing the German offensive. And he made it clear that no single commander, British or American, could claim ownership of the battle. The message was unmistakable. This was damage control at the highest level. Behind the scenes, Churchill applied pressure on Montgomery to clarify his remarks. Quietly, but firmly, Montgomery was forced to retreat from his earlier tone. He issued explanations, attempting to soften his statements and acknowledge American contributions. But the damage was already done. For Omar Bradley, the trust was gone. For George Patton, the insult was never forgotten. And for Eisenhower, the episode confirmed a hard truth. Unity among allies required constant restraint, humility, and political discipline. Bradley withdrew his resignation, but the relationship between American and British commanders never fully recovered. From that point on, cooperation continued, but warmth did not. American officers became more guarded. British commanders felt increasingly isolated, and Montgomery's reputation in the United States suffered permanent damage. Even after the war, Bradley would later write that Montgomery's press conference was one of the most dangerous moments of Allied cooperation, not because of what was said on the battlefield, but because of what was said to the world. The irony was cruel. Germany's last major offensive in the West had failed. Hitler's final gamble had been crushed. Victory was now inevitable. Yet the greatest threat to Allied unity in early 1945 did not come from German tanks or artillery. It came from words. A single press conference, a single claim of credit, and a reminder that even in a just war, ego could be as dangerous as any enemy. The Western Alliance survived the crisis, but it emerged changed. Trust had been tested, pride had left scars, and the final months of World War II were fought by allies who would never again see each other quite the same way. History often remembers battles and victories, but sometimes it is the moments behind microphones, not machine guns, that come closest to undoing everything.